Welcome to Conservative One, the podcast defending traditions and freedoms with George Christensen.
Never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never.
You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance.
Socialists don't like ordinary people choosing, for they might not choose socialism.
We cannot afford to be so politically correct anymore.
Conservative One.
G'day and welcome to Conservative One, the podcast defending traditions and freedom. I'm George Christensen, your host and Australian Member of Parliament, and I'm delighted with the guest that we've got with us today. He is a great man. He is actually a priest of the Church of God, in particular, a priest in the Church of England, where he served for some 37 years from 1980 through to 2017. He spent 23 of those years at the University of Sussex, where he was a senior lecturer and senior chaplain. He lectured in the psychology of religion. He lectured in literature. He convened a Master of Arts program in monotheist mysticism. He was employed as a freelance reporter by the BBC to present a weekly faith and ethics radio program for about 4 years. He's also widely written in periodicals like The Spectator, as well as The Times and the Daily Mail. In 2008, he was appointed chaplain to the Queen. Yes, to the Queen. He served in that role from 2008 to 2017. In 2017, he controversially resigned from the Church of England. We're going to hear more about that a bit later. But after that, he went on to serve as a bishop in a continuing Anglican church, a breakaway Anglican church. But recently, he's converted, or been received, I should say, into the Roman Catholic Church, where he is now an esteemed layman, and I assume that might go on to become an esteemed priest if they recognise the holy orders, which I'm sure they're going to. And I refer to Dr. Gavin Ashenden.
Hello, George. What a kind welcome. Thank you. Well, I'm not yet esteemed. I haven't done anything to be esteemed for yet as a lay Catholic. But yes, they are looking to see whether or not I can be reordained. My local Catholic bishop, who is a really wonderful man, and he is esteemed, asked me if when I might be likely to convert to Catholicism. And I said I had it in mind, like Constantine, to do it sometime before my deathbed. And he said, would you come now? We'd be glad for your help. And this seemed to me like a true vocation, the church calling you. And yeah, I couldn't find any. Obviously, I looked at both sides of the coin. I've taught myself to look at both sides of every argument for the whole of my adult life. I couldn't find any reason for saying I wouldn't come. And we'll probably get back to this. I'd given Anglicanism a shot at trying to reconfigure a kind of middle ground between Catholicism and Reformed, to see if we could withstand the extraordinary assault on the faith in our time. And I'd come to the conclusion that Anglicanism lacked one or two essential things it needed, much though I loved it. So yes, they're going to look to see whether I can be reordained, and that's in the hands of God and of the Vatican. So we'll see what happens.
We will touch on that, but I wanted to talk about your resignation from the Church of England, and that was a very specific thing. And it was probably a culmination of things happening, but it seemed that the press reported, at least at the time, that the straw that had broken the camel's back was when we had the Quran being read and preached from within one of the major cathedrals there. Could you just talk us through that?
Yes, but just for the sake of accuracy, I found myself being stripped of my Anglican identity, almost against my will, really, by circumstances, and then my response to it. So the reading of the Quran was the catalyst to my resigning as a chaplain to the Queen. And I can explain it really very quickly. There's a very colourful dean of Glasgow, of the Anglican Cathedral in Glasgow in Scotland, and he decided it would be a hospitable thing to reach out to the Islamic community. But he chose to do it on the Feast of the Epiphany, which, is everyone knows, is a really very important event, claiming, describing, celebrating certain things about the centrality of Jesus, who he is. and what he does for us. And he chose to invite a Muslim student to read during the Eucharist. Well, okay, that's not impossible. But he invited to read from the Quran. Well, that is unacceptable. And the passage he invited to read was the one that specifically repudiates and refutes Jesus' claims to be who he is. Yeah. So he had this extraordinary contradiction, which at the level of coherence and rationality was just a nonsense. But at the level of worship and witness was atrocious, and I would say blasphemous. I mean, I use that word carefully because one can't throw it around very much. But I decided to do nothing about it on the day I heard, because Scotland is a separate province, and for those people with a sense of ecclesiastical rules, that matters. But a few people in the cathedral complained bitterly, mainly some students who were faithful, and he set the police on them. So he had the police visit them and accuse them of homophobic hate crimes because he happens to be a prominent gay activist, and interpreted all criticism of any of his actions as homophobia.
A gay priest in the Anglican Church in Scotland that invited a Muslim student to read the Quran on Epiphany, on the celebration of Epiphany in church.
Yep.
Well, that's ticking all of the politically correct boxes there.
Yes. But it was a hate crime, and so setting the police on the students that I objected to. This is no longer a piece of ecclesiastical turf war. This moved the whole thing into a wider agenda. So I wrote a letter to the Times. I've written to the Times and for the Times London on a number of occasions, and I criticized him and said, this was completely wrong. Now, I've been speaking out for some time, and partly because of my experience at the University of Sussex, where I had spent nearly 25 years watching the cultural change take place. And I think for the first half of that, I was fairly sort of progressive. I was very much in love with Carl Gustav Jung, and I'd decided that Jung offered a kind of an interpretative key to the relationship between spirituality, psychology, and the human condition. For those who understand the psychological landscape, my defense is he was my antidote to Freud. And to those who don't, I will simply say that Jung is a very dangerous Gnostic false teacher. And as the culture war developed, I realized that I was becoming a Jungian instead of a Christian. I was taking Jung's interpretation of the spiritual journey instead of Jesus's. And what made me see that was the fact that the advertising for our culture in terms of the priority of sexual identity and sexual expression didn't deliver. What actually I was dealing with was very hurt, very confused, really quite seriously traumatized people who'd thrown themselves into the deep end of the multi-sexual pan-identity agenda that we'd had. And I realized it didn't work. It was damaging people. And there came a moment when I decided for the next year, I'll run a sort of Orthodox Christian pastoral theological interpretation alongside a progressive Jungian liberal interpretation of each encounter I have. And let's see which one tells the most truth. And by the end of the year, actually really quite a lot quicker, I realized I'd been bamboozled, and that the Orthodox, biblical, traditional one told the truth and the other one didn't. So this meant I had to change my mind about my allegiance to the contemporary culture. And I had to go around really, as it turned out, quite a lot of gay friends saying, look, I love you, I've always supported you, I've always wanted to protect you. And they said, yes, you've been pretty good on that. And I said, well, actually, we've been wrong. We've all got to repent. And this caused, and I'm going to be speaking about this in public. Please don't hear this as an attack on you personally. But I think we've all got it wrong. So from that point onwards, I found myself speaking out publicly against what I've called the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. Mm-hmm. And the business with the Quran, because I identified two main assaults on the Judeo-Christian tradition, one from the gay activist agenda and the other from Islam. And very interestingly, we may go into this later if there's time, but the gay activist agenda, which is driven by the hunt for equality and the redistribution of power in our society, has denoted Muslims as victims, and so gives them a free pass for everything. And one of the most extraordinary phenomena in our culture is the way in which feminism, in particular, refuses to direct any of its critique against Islamic culture and gives them this irrational free pass. Yes, that's right. So that's a brief background. I'd been speaking out and writing a bit about it fairly carefully. And after the Times published my piece criticizing the gay dean for using homophobia as a way of silencing Christians who legitimately complained about this abuse of Epiphany, I got a phone call from the palace, and the palace is not run by the Queen. It's run by, it's run by, if you like, a kind of internal civil service. And the head of the internal civil service phoned me up and said, "Dr. Ashenden, we've got a problem." And so I said, "Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how serious is it?" But the reason I'd done that is that the Archbishop of Canterbury had set a number of not very competent bishops on me for the last, I suppose this is Welby, not the Blessed Rowan Williams. And clearly they were trying to shut me up. So I get a phone call saying, "We're a bit upset about what you've written here, and you should consider being quiet." And so I would say to each of them, "Okay, look, here's everything I've written in the last 12 weeks. You tell me, what's wrong with it, where it offends anything Anglican, anything biblical, anything Christian, and then we can discuss it. And if I'm wrong, I'll apologize and change my ways." But of course, that wasn't the intention. The intention really was to bully me into silence.
That's right.
So having seen...
If you're anything like me, that would be like waving a red flag to a bull, trying to shut you up. So
I am like you. And I said, bring it on. Let's discuss this thing openly. I was very cross, actually, both that it originated from Lambeth and also that it wasn't even done by very clever people, which I objected to. I thought, at least set somebody on me that can give me a fair fight. So that's why when Buckingham Palace phoned up, I said, "Well, what's the score here?" Really, I was asking, "Are you trying to bully me, or is there a real problem?" And the answer was, "There's a real problem." On a scale of 1 to 10, he said, "Let's put it about 9.
Right.
No, I said, "Okay, well, let's deal with this quickly and clearly then. No posturing, no two adults with public responsibilities." And he said, "Look, you know as well as anybody that the Queen cannot be drawn into politics. She can't be drawn into culture wars. The whole integrity of the monarchy depends upon sitting light to that, and indeed it does." So he said, "Here's our problem. The general public are under the impression that when you speak out, you speak on behalf of the Queen, and the difficulty we have is you just might."
Yeah.
So then he said, "The other problem is that when you speak out, the general public think that the Queen listens to you and adapts her views to what you say. And the problem is she just might."
I wasn't going to go down this track, but she's a very faithful lady, isn't she? I mean, that we saw some great leadership from her recently with that coronavirus telecast that she did. But she is a lady of immense faith. Would that be right to say?
She's a wonderful Christian, but one has to distinguish between the Queen as the monarch and the Queen as Elizabeth Mountbatten.
Yes.
So the Queen as the monarch is the defender of the faith, whatever that odd phrase means, because it doesn't mean anything anymore. It was originally designed to complement Henry VIII on his repudiation of Luther's attack on Catholic doctrine. Mm-hmm. But so as the monarch, she has this constitutional role with the church. But as an individual, Elizabeth was profoundly influenced by Billy Graham and has a very real and authentic faith. And some people think that over the last 10 years, it's become much more articulate, particularly at a time of Christmas broadcast. So yes, she's a very faithful person. But he wasn't talking about her. He was talking about the Queen as monarch. Understood. And basically saying, you can't, because you have an association with the monarchy as a chaplain, you can't speak out publicly. So therefore, help us solve the problem. And I said, well, there are only two solutions. I either swear myself to silence or I resign. He said, yeah, that's what I think too. And he was being very careful not to ask me to resign, so I could never say they gave me the push. And again, that's quite right. And I think I think, to be honest, I had probably been a bit slow. I realized I was on thin ice. I had decided that God had given me this platform and I would use it. And I knew, like so many public platforms, like my radio show on the BBC, I knew it would come to an end, that the more, there would be a point where public opposition to the gospel would present a crisis and I would have to withdraw. I didn't know when it was, and I was surprised it was at that moment. And that was my ineptitude, really. I could have foreseen it. But if I had foreseen it, I'd have done nothing different. This was a matter of principle. And I believed that Christians have a duty, especially Christians who hold some kind of public office, have a duty to speak out in the public space and say, look, the demands of the gospel are these, and this is what's happening. And this is my take on the interaction of these two things. Now, you can make up your mind, but by speaking out, I'm hoping I will help you make up your mind. As in, you agree with me or you don't agree with me. It doesn't matter if you don't agree with me, but you need to think it through. And so I then handed in my resignation and asked if I could do it discreetly. I was embarrassed at having to resign, really. I thought maybe this was a lack of not having seen it coming. This was a lack of political skill or insight on my part. But to my great surprise, the whole thing blew up, and I found myself on the Bolt Report and Fox News at the end of the week, and so it gave me a worldwide public platform to continue to say these things. And from a theological point of view, I would say God is faithful and never mocked, and as one door closes, He will open a bigger and better door if He chooses.
It certainly looks like that door is open with your reception into the Roman Catholic Church, and I'd say that you took a very principled stand there, a stand of integrity.
Islamophobia hasn't killed anyone. Islamist terrorism has now killed tens of thousands of people.
Conservative One.
Could I bring us well forward to right now and this pandemic crisis that we're going through, happening in your country, happening in my country, happening all around the world? The UK, from what I can gather, is in a more sort of serious stage of lockdown, as you're calling it over there. We're not really calling it lockdown here. It's just self-isolation and social distancing. They're the sort of buzz phrases that are going around. What is happening over there? And I noticed that you had put a tweet up talking about the lockdown costing the economy a fair bit and costing the UK the ability to build 6 new hospitals each day. This will probably be an area where we disagree on. I don't think that, at least in Australia, I don't know the UK's situation, but in Australia, I don't think right now it's the time to lift restrictions, but it may be in the not too distant future. So I'm wondering what your view is on the pandemic in general, and also going to that tweet, your thoughts on ending the lockdown in the UK.
George, you may be right. I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm not an economist. And part of the problem is nobody has enough facts. So one of the reasons we're arguing in public is because there are a whole series of facts that nobody has access to, and time will tell. But leaving aside who's right for the moment, there's a sliding scale between not damaging the health service by having it overwhelmed with people succumbing to COVID-19 today, and taking such an economic hit that we can't fund the health service for the next 10 to 15 years because the money isn't there. So this is the problem that our politicians have. Now, if the coronavirus turns out to be a kind of pneumonia double plus, and then this raises the question of those who die with coronavirus and those who die from it, then it could be that the cure is worse than the disease. We will have damaged our capacity to fund our health service by taking too stringent a precaution. If, on the other hand, that's not true, and this turns out to be the most dreadful pandemic, then it will have been the right thing for the economy to take a hit, to save lives on that scale. There's the other problem that if it behaves like Spanish flu, hitting the virus hard and fast in the first wave won't have saved us from anything very much, because there'll be a second and third wave.
Come back, yeah.
And it's inconceivable we can lock the economy down for 2 or 3 years.
No, that is inconceivable. What are they doing in the UK? Just for my Australian listeners, what are the measures that are currently in place that you're having to abide by? Strict regulation and probably fine or jail as consequences if you break it.
Yes, I mean, they're very sensible. And they are, everyone who's not a non-essential worker, everyone who's not an essential worker stays home and doesn't come out apart from shopping and emergencies and a bit of exercise, and at all other times practice social distancing. I think a more interesting argument that we're having at the moment is whether or not the churches should close to enforce that. It seems to me, as I go shopping every so often, that the social distancing the supermarkets are engaging in is really very effective and very efficient. And first of all, there's some new science saying that you don't in fact get infected by the virus on surfaces, or we do with great difficulty, and you don't easily get infected by it in the open air. You do in a closed room, but not in the open air. So my view, given the facts that have come into the public domain, is that churches should not have allowed themselves to be closed down, because you can practice social distancing in a church just as much effectively as you can in a supermarket. But we have an obligation to God as we have an obligation to our bodies, and you set that obligation to worship, to pray, to witness aside at your peril. And I think that what the bishops have done in this country is they've closed all the churches, not as a health and safety measure to save people from getting infected, but as a piece of civic duty to set a good example. Well, I think that's absolutely crazy. We are not here to set, we do, as it happens, set good examples. We behave morally and sensibly, but we're not here to close down worship that could be conducted with the right social distancing without damaging anyone's health. And we should. I'm finding this stance taken by the bishops really very difficult to understand and sympathize with.
Yeah, look, I hear what you're saying. I have mixed views on that myself. I fully comprehend the argument that you are putting forward there, and I have a great deal of sympathy for it. I mean, if we're sacramental Christians, if we consider the Eucharist in particular the summit and source of life, being withheld from that is a great thing. It's a horrible thing. On the other hand, I also do see that if it was just open slather church, and I'm not saying that's what you're arguing for, but if it was just open slather, it could increase the risk of the communication of this virus, and that would be a big problem.
With respect, as a politician, you've done to me what your opponents do to you, which is you make a point, and then your critic, your critic then develops your point to far beyond the way you intended it to show it's a bad point.
Oh, really? Okay.
I mean,
no. But I know that's not what you're arguing.
If we're going to go into churches, we would practice the most hygienic social distancing. We would do everything right by the medical rule book. What I'm saying is that's possible. I'm not suggesting that there should be any level of medical or scientific irresponsibility. I'm just saying if we can do it in supermarkets, and we can, yes, we can do it in churches, and we can. So why aren't we?
Let's push that even a bit further here. I mean, in Australia, I don't know about in the UK, but I just found out to my dismay the other day that while we've cancelled elective surgery, that abortion clinics are still operational and deemed essential services. So we've got abortion clinics open, but churches closed. I found out, we've got adult stores or sex shops that are open. So this apparently is an essential service. We've got bottle shops, but I've got to tell you, that is an essential sale, the liquor stores. But these venues open, but churches not, and you can't social distance there. I think that, yes, there's going to have to be a bit of a look at that down the track, hopefully not too far down the track. Can I move on to bigger issues, I guess? You have, while you were serving as an Anglican clergyman and then as a continuing Anglican bishop, you very critical about Anglicanism and progressive Christianity overall. And I want to read back to you a great quote that you said. You said, "There's a civil war raging at the moment in Anglicanism and elsewhere between progressive Christianity that takes its priorities from the zeitgeist, the present culture, and a faithful Orthodox belief that keeps faith with what Jesus taught in the Gospels." You raised some of that as your rationale for leaving the Church of England and I guess moving towards Roman Catholicism. But this is a bigger problem than the Church of England. It's a problem that really this progressive form of Christianity has infected all of the mainline churches. And you know, I don't want to push this one too far, but the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope Francis, is often accused of being in that camp. How do you think there's going to be a restoration to Orthodox Christianity?
That's a very difficult question. I think perhaps only because those of us who believe in it articulate it and fight for it, explaining why we're fighting for it. I think the broader categories that we're dealing with are essentially the world of the spirit and the world of politics. So the liberal and progressive agenda looks to the world of politics and says, we have a relevance here, and Christian teaching and understanding is properly expressed in the following political ways. And this goes back really to when I was a young law student, and I became very interested in communism, and in particular in liberation theology. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful? Because it would be so cool. It would be so cool to be a communist Christian. It would be so cool to get involved in liberation theology, because I would get so much kudos from my political friends. You know, I would have a double whammy. I'd be spiritually on the button, and I'd be politically ahead of the curve. And, you know, that would be a great place to be. And as time has gone by over the last 35 years, I've looked at the political agenda, and I slowly come to realize that communism and the whole left-wing project is a form of utopianism that eventually leads to dystopia. You know, we've had lots of helpful insight into that through 1984 and Brave New World and Venezuela and Cuba and the USSR, China, and it's taken me really quite a long time to have the courage of my convictions and say the political outworking of the gospel is a dead-end street, and really it's a dangerous heresy. And when you look at the Gospels, you see that Jesus does absolutely nothing about the politics. He sidesteps it all the time. You could quite easily take all the political dynamics of the children of Israel being under an occupied, colonial, fascist power with a national identity and having national liberation built into the DNA of the prophetic tradition. It would be so easy for a Messiah to come along and say, let us throw these people off our backs and create the state God wants us to create. But even in that highly charged circumstances where you could have had a political reading, and you know, a lot of people think that Judas had that reading with a lot of the other freedom fighters of the day, the kind of the successors to the Maccabees. Jesus didn't do it. He avoided it at all costs. And the reason he avoided it is because of the world of the spirit, which he spent so long teaching about, starting with Nicodemus. And I mean, there's a wonderful miracle I like where in the Gospel of John, a man has a 2-stage healing from blindness. You know, first of all, Jesus lays hands on him and puts paste on his eyes, and he sees shapes, and then there's a second stage. And I think in a way that Orthodox Christianity is a bit like a 2-stage healing. It's quite easy, not easier, but you know, there's a naturalness in becoming a Christian and then trying to apply your faith to make the world a better place. But there's a deeper, more authentic Christianity, which is that the world doesn't become a better place by picking up political solutions. Now, there's a very delicate balance here, because if you live a covenantal life, if you keep the 10 Commandments, if you keep the Christian moral laws, you make a better society. It comes as a response to a lifestyle. But if you try and impose that lifestyle politically without the spiritual rejuvenation inside, it doesn't work. And so my view to political progress has always been, let's convert people to Jesus. The more people we convert to Jesus, the greater the political revolution will be. But it's got to be by that route. Now, the progressive view takes it the other way around. It says, if we can gain some political kudos and make some real political change, we will attract people to Christ and Christianity. And that's how we'll do our evangelism. I think that's a complete misreading of the gospel. It's a really serious category error. It's splitting the church, and it's disastrous. So how will we win? And the answer is only by continuing to bring people to Jesus for a conversion, a new spiritual life, and continuing to present our understanding of Scripture and tradition in that way. And there's one could then go off into church history and spirituality and begin to see how those narratives play into this. But that's what I think is going on. It's basically the Holy Spirit versus the spirit of politics.
The spirit of politics versus the Holy Spirit. That is a topic that we could go on and on about, and I think we should go on and on about it. I propose that we break for now to give the listeners a bit of a reprieve, and we come back in the next episode of Conservative One, where we'll talk more about the clash point between the culture and Christianity and many more issues, because I know that there's lots more that you've got to talk about, Dr. Ashenden. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and tune in again to hear more of Dr. Gavin Ashenden on Conservative One, the podcast defending traditions and freedom.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
You've been listening to the Conservative One podcast with George Christensen.
God